Everybody, today's lesson we are going to be looking at reading scales and what they're all about. Okay, so we'll look at scales, reading scales, and then of course maybe identifying and labelling up some scales. Alright, so let's get started anyway. So what are scales? Well, scales are used to indicate the units, the size of a unit of measurement. Alright, it can come with a variety of different things, and industries often use them to display weights, volume, pressure, speed, temperature, loads of different kind of ones. I suppose they're kind of more historic kind of things, and if you go into a car, you might see the speedometer, but maybe in these days you might see a digital display, but certainly you're going to come across them from time to time, so it's really important you're able to kind of read and use scales, essentially. Okay, so let's have a look. So let's have a look at a scale here. So to read a scale, there are three things that need to be looked at. Okay, so three particular things. The first one is of course the units, and they're normally kind of shown somewhere on the scale to kind of enter. You can see it from here, so they're in kilograms, and then we need some gauge from here to give us the range between either the beginning and the end, so we can identify what it is we're looking at. Without any numbers, it would be kind of pointless, really. All right, so we need some numbers. It won't necessarily include all the numbers, and that's where the kind of challenge kind of comes in, because the chances are that you're going to have a starting point and an end point, and then if somewhere in between, then this is where you need to be able to kind of measure it. All right, and then you've got some kind of needle or marker to identify what the reading is. Okay, so you can see here we've got a little arrow, and of course it can go anywhere along here, and eventually when it's taken its reading, it should stop, ideally, and so you can read it from there. All right, so a marker's going to move along the scale to help you identify the reading. Okay, so reading scales then. So you might have looked from the previous one and noticed that there were certain numbers from 0 to 400, but only with 100, 200, 300 in between. Chances are that your reading is going to be somewhere in between. So you're going to look at the gaps that are in between, and you need to determine what those gaps represent. And obviously the number of little markers in between will determine what those gaps are. All right, and sometimes you'll be able to read fairly accurately, and sometimes it'll be a bit of estimation work, really, but we'll look at that in a bit more depth as we look. So looking at this little speedometer, you can see it kind of moving up, and it asks you to say what's the speed shown on this speedometer. Well, the first we're looking for is, well, what are the units? Well, we can see the units on here. You've got kilometers per hour. All right, so this is in kilometers per hour. That's the first thing. And then the next bit, we're going to look at the difference between the two values either side of here. So you can see we've got 80, and then we've got 60, and we're looking at the gap between these two to determine what these little increments are in between. So 80 take away 60 is 20, so that means the gap between these two is 20, and you can see there are 1, 2, 3, 4 increments in between. Okay, so if I do 20 divided by those 4, then each one of these little increments, which I've just kind of showed here, is going to be 5 kilometers an hour each time. Okay, so when I try to read this one, we've obviously got the 60, which is here, and now I'm going to go 65, 70, 75 kilometers an hour. All right, now you may look at this and thinking, well, it looks like slightly less than 75 kilometers, and you might be right. It might be about 74, it might be 74.5, but in terms of what we can see, it's close to 75 kilometers an hour based on those increments that we can see. Okay, so that's the speedometer. That's how that might look, but we might see a different one. So here you can see a temperature or a thermometer, and from here again, looking at units, we've got the units at the top, which is degrees Fahrenheit. All right, you might be more familiar with degrees centigrade these days, but certainly degrees Fahrenheit still exists. And like last time, we're looking at, you can see we've got 40, 80, 120, and then we've got these little increments in between. So again, we're trying to determine what these little increments are so we can read this particular value here. All right, so like last time, we're going to look at the gap between the two. Now, I could do 120 take away 80. That would be absolutely fine, or 80 take away 40. The increments are going to be the same. And you'll notice from here, this is incorrect straight away. 80 take away 40 is actually 40. So we need to kind of clarify that. And over here you can see it now corrects it. So the increments, let's have a look. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So there are 8 gaps. So we're going to do 40 divided by 8, and not the 20, and that's going to give 5. So again, like the speedometer, really, it increments in 5 each particular time. So when we're trying to read this particular one, we can either go from 120 count down in 5s, or we'll go from 80 up in 5s. All right, so I'm going to go 80 up in 5, so 80, 85, 90, 95, 100, and looks like it's going to be 105 degrees Fahrenheit, which is pretty warm. Okay, so 105 degrees Fahrenheit for that particular one. Okay, so that's reading scales. Let's think about that on a backward thing. It might be that you're given the value, the actual temperature or kilometers per hour or whatever that is, and maybe you need to mark it off on the particular scale given. All right, so maybe adding the dial or the measurement lines, so it's kind of the other way around. Similar kind of process. You need to figure out what the increments are, and then from there determine where your marker should particularly go. So on here it says label the speed 95 kilometers per hour on the speedometer. Well, we can see we've got 80, and you can see we've got 100. And we did this one before, but we follow the same process. Then we're looking to figure out where to put 95 in between these particular ones. So we're looking at the increments here. So you can see we're going to follow the same process, 100 take away 80. So you can see that each one of these is going to be 5 kilometers at a time. And of course, we're going to work up from there. So I'm going to take 80, 85, 90, 95. So I need to put my marker here to represent 95 kilometers per hour. So let's get that moved up. So we start with 80, then 85, then 90, and of course up to 95. So I want to put my pointer in there.